Hey, what's up, everybody? The Extended Phenotype by Richard Dawkins, another Oxford landmark science book. As you may know, Richard Dawkins is an evolutionary biologist and an author of many best selling science books. The Extended Phenotype is a follow up for his first book, The Selfish Gene, which I really enjoyed and would recommend to anyone. So, the selfish gene is an idea about a different way to look at evolution. Rather than looking at individual organisms as the principal units of selection, the selfish gene sees the genes themselves as the principal units which are selected in evolution. This is gene selectionism. It's a pretty fascinating idea which, when explored in depth, can make for a powerful way of looking at nature. This is what this book, The Extended Phenotype, does. It explores more deeply the ideas in a selfish gene and builds on them. Most interestingly is the idea of the extended phenotype itself. Dawkins takes this idea to places most of us would never have thought of. This is an incredibly fascinating book. Maybe it would be best to just start with a quick overview of some of the main ideas in the book. I'm not going to cover each chapter because that would take a very long time. It's a fairly large book at over 400 pages. And before getting into that, I should mention that this book was not written for the general public. So this review is going to reflect that. And if you don't like that, you certainly will not enjoy reading this book because it can be very technical and it requires a lot of prerequisite knowledge. Unlike all his other books, The Extended Phenotype was written for people who are already educated in genetics and evolution. So, what does the extended phenotype mean? Well, first you have to understand the selfish gene. That's half of the extended phenotype. The classic understanding of a phenotype is that it's the physical expression of the genotype. It's the alleles that were expressed in the thing that we're looking at, blue eyes or feather length or whatever. The extended phenotype takes the idea that a phenotype doesn't have to be part of an animal's body. It can be an artifact like a termite mound or a beaver dam, or it can even be part of some other animal's body. Dawkins says, an animal's behavior tends to maximize the survival of the genes for that behavior, whether or not those genes happen to be in the body of the particular animal performing it. These are things that are naturally selected for, just like genes in an organism, and that's what this book is mostly about. Dawkins states that he isn't necessarily saying that the extended phenotype is the proper way to see things, but just another way to see things, which is kind of funny because throughout the rest of the book, he goes on to show how the selfish gene and extended phenotype views provide a better understanding than the organism-centric view. Dawkins shines light on what the conventional geneticist can see versus what the extended geneticist can see. And people of today's modern way of thinking will be happy to hear Dawkins on genetic determinism. He says your genome doesn't necessarily dictate your future. You may have a certain gene, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to express the phenotypic trait associated with that gene. There are things that happen in nature and things that you can do to counter the effects of that gene. He makes this clear for multiple reasons, so the reader will understand that when a geneticist says something like a gene for X, they're just using that language as a matter of convenience. Of course, it's more complicated than a gene for X. Secondly, besides the particular gene you inherit, what is critically important is the gene environment. This is the other genes that are part of the total genome, and they make a difference in the way that that gene is expressed. It's not as simple as you have a gene for X, so X will be expressed in the phenotype. Dawkins says, the same gene may confer high fitness in one genetic background and be virtually lethal in another. And Dawkins goes on to clear up more concepts such as adaptionism, Lamarckianism, the uses of the word fitness, and the Gaia hypothesis, to name a few. Why does an animal behave in a way that goes against the interest of the organism? The selfish gene view makes it clear it's for the same reason that we have so much of what is called junk DNA, which is DNA that doesn't code for anything. Selection has been and is working for the genes themselves, not necessarily the individuals or the population. To quote Dawkins, From the point of view of the selfish genes themselves, there is no paradox. The true purpose of DNA is to survive, no more, no less. The simplest way to explain surplus DNA is to suppose that it is a parasite, or at best, a harmless but useless passenger hitching a ride in the survival machines that created by the other DNA. Francis Crick called the spread of functionless DNA a cancer of the genome. Dawkins spends a lot of time discussing things like evolutionary arms races, sexual selection, and kin selection because of how important they are to the way evolution works, and they're relevant to the selfish gene and extended phenotype views. You also have outlaw genes or meiotic drive genes and modifiers that suppress their efforts. You can even have parasites and hosts that share a phenotype. Another interesting view in this book is that you have different kinds of replicators and you have vehicles. The replicators we're interested in are the genes themselves, and the vehicles are the bodies that carry them. These bodies, luckily for us, evolved for the genes because that's how natural selection has played out so far. So you have replicator selection and you have vehicle selection. These are two different things that can seem like they work together, but the organism is the tool of the DNA and not the other way around. If natural selection is a battle of genes, our bodies are a landscape for some of those battles. So how did bodies ever come into being in the first place? Well, the replicators that didn't group together would have been overwhelmed by the ones that did. The gene-centric view is fascinating. You're going to want to stop and take some time to just dwell on it. Think about things like what was happening before bodies arose. Another thing I thought was interesting was Dawkins states that it's not far-fetched to imagine a reversal of the central dogma of genetics, which is DNA makes RNA makes proteins, because all you're doing is reverse translating. But I'm not so sure, because consider the amino acid leucine. There are 6 different codons that code for leucine. So how would you reverse translate that and know that you got the right combination? Or would it matter? I don't know, I think it would, because a mutation at one of the 3 bases could result in a different protein. Anyway, this book is completely packed with fascinating information, and I'm very glad I read it, but I'm not sure I'd recommend it to many people. Certainly not before reading The Selfish Gene. In the extended phenotype, Dawkins will frequently use disciplinary jargon and bring out complicated concepts and not explain what they mean or where they came from. This might be the most difficult book I've ever read. So you really have to know what you're getting into with this book, and Dawkins does address that in the preface. There were so many times while reading this when I thought, man, if I didn't happen to already know what that meant, I would be completely lost. And there were plenty of times when I was completely lost. I have no idea of how much I missed out on in this book because much of it simply went over my head. I've taken one genetics class and I've read about just about every Dawkins book, and there were plenty of times when the information in this book was unusable to me because I just didn't know. And then there were times when the information was so dense and complicated that I didn't want to spend the time trying to figure out and understand what it meant, so I just powered through it. But for all the times that I did understand it, it was excellent. So, as much as I enjoyed this book, I was pretty glad when it was over. I don't think I've ever felt as much of a sense of accomplishment after reading a book as I did with this one. That being said, with how fascinating the ideas in this book were, I really think Dawkins should consider rewriting a more accessible version of this book, kind of like Stephen Hawking did with A Briefer History of Time. Anyone who's read this book will know what I mean, and it's a shame that more people won't experience it because of how unapproachable it can be at times. I think he could easily capture the things that made this book so amazing while going for a more approachable approach. Richard Dawkins has stated that out of all of his books, this is the one he wants most people to read, which I can understand because the ideas are so interesting, but this was his second book, and to date, he's never written anything else that's as technical as this one. I want people to read what's in this book too, but I can completely understand why a person would DNF this book. Okay, well that's going to do it for this one, guys. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Have you read this book? If so, what did you think? If you haven't and you're interested in natural selection and genetics and you really want to challenge yourself, or maybe you just want to be able to say that you read every Richard Dawkins book, check out The Extended Phenotype.